It's a marvelous question. The embargo is troubling. I am kinder about the embargo than most people because I think it was the least bad choice. I think he did have as ever, you can create a sense of his view of warfare as in a utopian Enlightenment way. He was not as good on defense spending as he should have been, but he wasn't as bad as people think. And he was very unlucky, I believe. Jefferson was very unlucky in Henry Adams because you had a brilliant writer who had a particular point of view. And actually, when you look at Adams and the embargo, it's amazing to me how even-handed, to some extent, in other places, Adams is about Jefferson. I don't think he admired what he said, but I admired it, which is that the wonderful line that his command was more of love and more based on love and sympathy than on authority, which he disliked, but which sounds to me like a pretty good democratic, lowercase d, politician. Every letter, and Barbara Oberg at Princeton, the Princeton Papers, very generously gave me transcripts of forthcoming volumes. I think they're in 1802 at volume 112. Maybe it's a little less, but 38, I think, right? 39 or 40. So they're still coming. But every letter, almost every letter, in which Jefferson discusses the embargo, he discusses preparations for war. And I believe he always knew it was coming and had found himself and the country rather flat-footed in terms of preparedness. Not the last time that would happen. And to be quite serious, if it were not for the country of your birth and Winston Churchill and the remarkable achievements of seemingly ordinary Englishmen, we would all very possibly be living in a very different world. Because when our leadership in 1940 and 41 was trying to prepare the country to confront an overt evil, including in a speech here in Charlottesville, nobody was listening very well. So the debt we owe England at that point is beyond measure. So it wouldn't be the last time we had been ill prepared for war. And so my view of the embargo is he needed to do something fairly quickly. He also undertook, in that example, talk about Hamiltonian means, it was a breathtaking expansion of federal power. I mean, he had the power. I mean, here's the great hands-off, Adam Smith was a socialist sort of guy, saying, I can decide which ship goes and which ship doesn't. And so he believed he was in an existential crisis. He took those steps. It didn't work out. And the war came, as someone once said. And that was not a great hour. But I do think it is of a piece with his attempt to find a solution in real time. Because I think it was more. I think he did it more because we weren't prepared than he did it because it was a proactively utopian thing. Does that make sense? That actually answers the question you asked, as opposed to what I was saying. Yes, ma'am. What in this? Did y'all hear that? What in this book did I lose the most sleep in deciding what to do with? All right. Now it can be told. Leslie kindly took me on a horse ride up the way Jefferson would have come. And I last wore denim in the Carter administration. And so Court very generously loaned me a pair of blue jeans, which broke a 35-year streak of mine about not wearing denim. So that was a complicated moment. I think so let's talk about me and my needs. This is no. I swore I was not going to make a Petraeus joke about biography. I swore. Before my Lord, sorry. I think anyone confronting Jefferson and slavery and Indian removal about which I know a great deal because of Jackson and because I'm from Tennessee, which is entirely Cherokee land. Jefferson was complicit in the twin tragedies of American life, right up to his waist and higher. And I find it remarkable to think about, and there have been books called Jefferson's Pillow, but when you think about his first memory allegedly being handed up to a slave on a horse on the way to Tuckahoe on a pillow, and then you go to Nicholas Trist's and Jefferson Randolph's accounts of the last days in July of 26, and he's uncomfortable, but he can't make the white family understand what to do, and it's an enslaved servant who understands, reads it correctly, and shifts the pillow. So there it all is. His whole life was made possible. The life of this place, the life of the land on which we're standing. And so confronting that is sleep losing. My own view is that the sins of Jefferson were the sins of the country. He was in a mainstream of moral blindness that was so prevalent that it took another 35 years after he died to begin a civil war that cost 600,000 lives to adjudicate this. So, the great James Parton line, if America's right, Jefferson's right. If Jefferson's wrong, then America's wrong. It's a hell of a burden to put on any one person. You don't hear that about Alexander Hamilton. You don't hear that about Washington. You don't hear that about Adams. And I think the reason you hear it is that we see the best of us and the worst of us in this man, all wrapped up in one. I think that's why he resonates still. Go to the back and then to the front.
You spend a lot of time on Jefferson's use and desire for power, but if wielding power were the means, what do you believe Jefferson's ideal end would be in the use of power?
The survival and success of the American Revolution. That the experiment in Republican government and the creation of a culture that would nurture Republican virtues of sociability, education, somewhat affability to some extent, morality, with or without a religious context, that what had been undertaken for whatever set of reasons, largely economic, both economic and ideological, in the mid-1770s, I believe he would have judged his life a failure beyond redemption, I think, if America had lost territory to the British, if they'd been forced into a rump government situation. I think he had invested his life, and you read those letters late in life to Adams and all the way through. The revolution is an organic, it's almost a child to him. It's something he helped create, that he felt an obligation to protect, to grow, and I think that was an end that was so consuming that it justified almost anything else he did. And he saw the election of 1800 as a revolution as real in our forms and practices, I think is the phrase, certainly in our forms, as real as the revolution of 76. So he saw his own election as an hour of redemption because he believed in the 1790s that the Federalists were running away with the revolution. And he was there, as Bill Buckley said in other contexts, to stand athwart history and yell, "Stop." And that's what he did. Somebody was here. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on the relationship between Jefferson and Adams?
There's a wonderful new word in our language for it, frenemy. Right? I think it's wonderful to follow. I mean, it's the best. You can put it on Showtime, because I think there was a genuine. What I take away from it is, despite the deep and genuine disagreement about federalism versus republicanism, which when they began their correspondence, put together by Benjamin Rush in kind of a Cyrano moment, I love that. All of life is high school. You know, Rush said to Adams, oh, he really wants to write you. He said to Jefferson, he really wants to write you. And they're like, oh, well, if he really wants to write me, I'll, you know, Rush is a genius. He was the Richard Holbrooke of our time. Even in those letters, early on, I think in 16, Adams says, we will always disagree. It's a wonderful line because it's of the measures of your administration and that of Mr. Madison's, I disagree totally, and always will. I believe that history will prove me right. I know you think history will prove you right, but it will prove me right. Essentially, is what he said. And Jefferson tried to avoid that. He actually said we should not buckle on like Priam of old, the party armor, and become the athletes of party once again. And so they would drift into more philosophical things. What I love about that is I think that moment in the correspondence shows that you can genuinely disagree with someone about the most fundamental question and still find personal ties of affection and mutual respect because they'd been through the wars together, right? And I think particularly toward the end, you know, it was like folks who just read the obituaries first thing in the morning. I mean, they would write each other about there are 3 more dropped, you know. And there's this feeling, you know, as the shadows lengthen, there's this feeling of the two of them being the last, you know, the Argonauts. Wonderful image Jefferson has when he's sending Jefferson Randolph to Massachusetts on a tour. And he writes a letter of introduction to Adams saying he would like to, I think it was Randolph, it was a grandson, saying he would like to be able to say in future years that he sat with the Argonauts over the fire and that he saw the great man, you know, the great men of their time. I mean, these were wonderfully historically conscious people. One of the things I adore about this house and the way it's been preserved is how Jefferson commemorated people he couldn't stand. Right? I mean, there's the bust of Hamilton, and he would make the joke about there was a bust of Hamilton. Was it sriracha? Okay. It's a kind of pasta, I think. So Jefferson and Hamilton would face each other, and Jefferson would say, "There we are, opposing each other in death as we were in life." But Hamilton was there, and Adams was there, and clearly, the culture of the house, to my eye, is about building a national memory. And even if they disagreed, these were the Olympians. And he clearly saw themselves that way. I mean, it's very conscious, very self-conscious. You know, those letters, anybody who thinks those letters that Adams and Jefferson wrote were meant for Adams and Jefferson, no. Don't buy hurricane insurance. I mean, you know, they knew these would be read. They knew we would be standing here. Well, they hoped so much that we would be. So, one more hand. Yes, sir. Sorry.
What did Jefferson think about the worst excesses of the French Revolution?
The worst excesses of the French Revolution. What did Jefferson think? He was against them, as we say in the South. You know, he was very slow. Connor Cruz O'Brien has written about this. This was the great, not only now, but in real time, Jefferson's overly weakness for the French Revolution was a defining element in early American politics. He left in '89, so he was there for the Bastille, talked about, actually made light of it, said, you know, there are things happening where sometimes I check to make sure my head is still on my neck, which is very funny unless your head's just been cut off. And my view is that as he got farther away, it was easier to romanticize what was going on. Let me unpack that just for a second, because everybody, when it started, saw the two revolutions as linked. I quote John Marshall in the book, I think, saying, even as late as 1790, I want to say, clearly everybody was for this. If liberty was to survive in America, it would survive in France, and if not, the other thing this goes back to is this 50-year war idea. If they had a restoration, as the English had in the 17th century, why couldn't America then have a restoration? I think the role of the English Civil War is hugely important as well. Very quickly, the language and imagery of the English Civil War, from Edgehill, which was the name of a battle in the Civil War, to where it's familiar as Munich or Pearl Harbor, that kind of language for us. So what did all these dramas have in common? That liberty had died. That something like the American Revolution, the experiment in liberty, had fallen apart. And so everybody early on wanted this to work. As it got worse and worse, the Federalists peeled away first. Some moderate Republicans peeled away. Jefferson had a hard time. And I think it was because he married this belief, this common American belief that the revolutions were linked to his personal experience in a way. And he was not above a kind of self-satisfied in intellectual mean. I don't want to call it intellectual arrogance because I don't think that's right. But he had experienced more of France than any other American at that point. And I suspect felt rather more expert than the people who were talking about it. And I think that sometimes that has the effect in a human way of making one sort of closed-minded about it. One more hand back there. Yes, sir.
Given that the New York Times didn't seem satisfied with your addressing of the Hemings relationship,
They didn't? It's hard to satisfy the New York Times.
But since the start of your book, and of course there'll probably always be DNA analysis, but a number of scholars continue to not accept or agree with the accepted views. Where do you think that debate goes in the future?
Well,
Sorry for easy question.
no. I mean, my view is that he was the father of those children. And I agree with, even pre-DNA, I agree with the preponderance of oral history and coincidence is such that it makes sense to me. I don't see why I don't like using this word as a verb, but I don't see why we privilege white oral history over African American oral history reflexively, which is what happened for a long time, I think, in a lot of quarters. And so why is Madison Hemings any less a reliable witness than Martha Jefferson? So there's that. I also believe that it strains credulity that Thomas Jefferson, widowed in early midlife, who had vast and compelling appetites for power, art, wine, food, architecture, books, would stop short of the most sensuous human activity. I just don't think that's... And again, he hides in plain sight. One of the first letters we have, he's writing about having sex with either enslaved women or prostitutes in Williamsburg or white servant women. There's a letter to John Page talking about this. So it's kind of there. And we also need to remember Jefferson had a very clear view of sexual activity, which is that it was a critical faculty, that this was an important part of being healthy and being human. So all of that suggests to me that it's very unlikely that he was celibate for 46 years. And I don't mean to be glib about it. I just think that's true. I don't know. I'm asked sometimes about what I think the emotional content of the Hemings relationship might have been. I think the truth is very cold, probably, my best guess. I mean, he did record the births in the farm book. I think it may have been more utilitarian for him than we might like to think, but that's my personal view. And where does it go? I'm for exhumation. I've been meaning to tell Leslie that. Sorry. Did I mention this before? Let's be clear. Who would be happiest if he were exhumed to settle a long-standing question in which developing science could settle a question of historical dispute? He'd be out there with a shovel tomorrow. You'll notice she just got up.